Welcome to the AT Parenting Survival Podcast, where you get help and guidance through the chaos of parenting a child with anxiety or OCD. This show is for educational purposes and is not intended to replace the guidance of a qualified professional. Here's your host, child therapist, Natasha Daniels.
Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of the AT Parenting Survival Podcast. I'm excited about today's episode because I feel like a lot of people do not understand the go-to therapy modality to treat pediatric OCD, which is ERP. And I'll talk about what that stands for and what it is in a second. But there are a lot of misunderstandings between parents and even therapists about what ERP is and what it is not and how it works. So hopefully this episode will just add to your knowledge because the more we know, the more we can help our kids and the more we can spot good versus not so great therapists. This episode is sponsored by OCD. OCD offers affordable, effective, convenient therapy, and they are available in the U.S. and outside of the U.S. You can schedule your free 15-minute consultation to see if OCD is a right fit for you and your child. Just go to treatmyocd.com. That's treatmyocd.com. I'll leave a link in the show notes. And one of the reasons why I love OCD, and this is just me talking, is that I know that they train their therapists to do ERP. So I know that if you are seeing someone from OCD, they are at least trained and skilled in understanding ERP. And you can't say that about every therapist. We're going to talk about that today. That is the topic for today's episode. I also want to mention that I do have a free webinar if you are new to this journey or new to understanding your child's OCD. I have a webinar that is things that parents should definitely know if they are raising a child with OCD. You can check it out. It is free. Go to natashadaniels.com/OCD webinar. Let's just first talk about what ERP is. And I do have a whole podcast on that. That goes way back to episode 53. We're on episode 369. So way back. So you can check that out. If you go to my website at atparentingsurvival.com, scroll all the way to the bottom, there's a search button. If I ever say this episode or that episode, or you just want to know if I have an episode or a YouTube video on a topic, because I do make YouTube videos every Thursday as well, go to my website and click on the search button and type in whatever I'm talking about. So in this case, type in ERP or type in the number 053, and this episode will pop up if you're having a hard time finding it on your podcast platform. Sometimes it's hard to search on a podcast platform, and it's actually easier just to go to my website and search from there. Because every podcast I do and every YouTube video I do, I upload also on my website. So that makes it really easy to have kind of a search database on my website. Okay, so I will briefly tell you what ERP is, though. ERP stands for Exposure Response Prevention. It is a type of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. So if a therapist says, I specialize in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, it does not mean that they know anything about ERP because ERP is a type of CBT. Sorry with all these acronyms. And you have to go and get your own advanced training on ERP unless you're incredibly fortunate that they taught it to you in graduate school. But I would have to say 99.9% of graduate programs do not teach ERP, which is appalling, and that's a whole nother podcast. But you have to go out and get your extra training through like the International OCD Foundation or other institutes that will train you in understanding ERP. And that's why there are so many therapists who are not skilled and trained in ERP, because you really have to take that initiative to get that postgraduate training. So ERP is systematically exposing the person to their OCD intrusive thought or feeling. I kind of equate it to going to the OCD gym, metaphorically. You know, that I'm going to purposely trigger OCD. I'm going to trigger a thought or a feeling, and then I'm not going to do the compulsion. That's the RP, the response prevention. So I'm going to expose myself to something that I know is going to trigger OCD. And then the response prevention, I'm not a fan of the name ERP. Response prevention sounds so clinical, but I'm preventing the response that OCD would want, whatever compulsion that would be. whether it's mental or physical. I'm not going to do the compulsion. I'm going to sit with the discomfort. And the more I learn how to sit with the discomfort, the more power I take back for myself. We're going to talk about what that looks like as we go through these incorrect assumptions, because then it gets muddy from there. So people will take that, and sometimes, you can take a little bit of knowledge and do damage because you don't fully understand it, or make assumptions because you don't fully understand it. And so I'm going to tell you some of the assumptions that I see people making. And I know in the AT parenting community, my membership community, I get nervous when parents will say to me, what are some exposures for this? And I'm always like, did you take the course first? As a member, they get free access to my course, How to Teach Kids to Crush OCD. And I walk through all the important things that you need to know that we're going to talk about today in order to do effective exposures. And I go in depth. I train the parent to understand the nuances of exposures and how to do it in a way that's effective. And I don't want to just give people ideas of how to do exposures without knowing that they have the background and the information to do it effectively. So some people incorrectly assume that if they have an OCD theme, then there's just a list of exposures to do. And so I'll get that a lot from people in general online when they're reaching out for me, or like, let's say I post a reel, they'll say, what's an exposure for over wiping? Or what's an exposure for, I'm trying to think of an example, moral OCD? Or what would be an exposure for somebody who's afraid of contamination? And it's such a broad, it's like saying if somebody has a fever, like what's the protocol? Well, actually, that's a stupid thing to say. I mean, obviously you take some aspirin or like some ibuprofen, but we don't know what's underneath that. Like what's causing the fever? Yeah, we're going to treat the fever, but also I want to know, do you have a rash? Do you have other symptoms? Because we want to get to the origin of it. And so the first incorrect assumption is thinking that you can just jump into doing exposures. And I think it's a great one to start off with because this is where a lot of errors are made, both as a therapist and also in the parent world, that we hear about ERP and we think, oh, this is like pretty easy. There's no rocket science here, which there isn't, but it's a little bit of science. And so parents or therapists just think, I just need to expose them to something. And so what do I expose them to if they have moral OCD? What do I expose them to if they wash their hands too much? What do I expose them to if they can't touch a doorknob? What do I expose them to if they say I'm sorry too much? And we have to know the core fear. In order to make effective exposures, you don't always have to know the core fear. I talk about OCD treatment or how we approach OCD. And I talk about this in my book, Crushing OCD Workbook for Kids. It's brand new. It just came out. I teach this in my workbook. I teach it in my courses, that there is offense and defense. And I've seen therapists do one or the other and not both. And to me, both are really powerful and both need to be done and both need to be taught. And so with defense, I need to know when OCD comes knocking, what do I do? How do I respond? So if OCD wants me to wash my hands, or OCD wants me to confess to my parent, or OCD wants me to not sit on the left side of the couch, or OCD wants me to tap 3 times before I leave, what am I going to do with that bossy demand that OCD is giving me in that moment? That's defense, because I'm defending myself. OCD is coming knocking and I'm defending myself. What am I going to do? Am I going to do what OCD wants? Am I going to delay it? Am I going to ignore it? What am I going to do? That's defense. And it's defense because OCD is the one initiating the disruption. Does that make sense? It should. Offense is when I am going to initiate an interaction with OCD. I'm going to go sit on the left side on purpose because OCD doesn't like when I sit on the left side of the couch. I'm going to maybe check my clock 3 times instead of 4 times because OCD doesn't like the number 3. Or I am going to go touch something and then not wash my hands because I know OCD would freak out if I touched that and not washed my hands. It's offense. I am the one on the attack. I am triggering OCD. I am doing something on purpose. This is the exposure. I'm doing something on purpose, and that I'm not giving OCD what it wants. I'm not scratching any itch that OCD wants scratched. And so that is offense. People often mess up in two ways. They think that defense is ERP. So they think that by not responding to an OCD demand, I'm doing ERP. No, you're not doing ERP, but you're doing something really, really important that is part of the treatment to crush your OCD. It's part of what I teach. It's part of what I teach parents to teach their kids is, how do I respond when OCD is bothering me? And sometimes I'll be able to delay it. Sometimes I won't. But that is a skill that we want to teach. But that is not ERP. ERP is when I am going to say, I am going to purposely pet the dog, which is going to really upset my OCD, because my OCD says you can't get near the dog because you might be sexually inappropriate with the dog. It's true. I want to use examples that are maybe taboo so you see what OCD can do. And I'm going to put the dog on my lap and I'm going to pet it. And that's going to trigger all sorts of alarms to OCD. You can't do this. What if you're touching the dog inappropriately? And then normally I maybe wouldn't be able to put the dog in my lap. I'm going to put the dog in my lap. And then maybe after that, I might have to confess to my parent, but I'm not going to do that this time. Or maybe I'd have to wash my hands. I'm not going to do that this time. Or maybe I would have to mentally argue in my head whether that was inappropriate or not. I'm not going to do that. And so I'm purposely doing an action and I'm not doing the compulsion. And that is the offense of ERP. And so I guess I'm kind of combining two incorrect assumptions in one go. I'm recording this late. I normally record these in the morning, but it was so nice and beautiful out that I was like, I'm just going to go sit outside. I'll record this later. And so now you're getting my mush brain, which is not as organized as my 7 a.m. brain. You're getting my 7 p.m. brain. So I apologize for that. But I'm smushing two together. So one is mixing up offense and defense, right? So you're doing defense, but you're actually thinking it's offense. I've seen a lot of therapists do that where they're like really just teaching the child how to delay and ignore without any offense. The other one, though, that I had brought up before that I want to dive more into is not understanding the core fear that drives it. So let's talk more about that one. And then we're going to take a break and we'll go into a whole bunch more. So when I don't understand the core fear, let me give you an example. And I use this example a lot because it's a really good one. It's just so simplistic. And it's happened a lot in my practice. Let's say I have 3 kids who all have OCD and they all will not touch doorknobs. So they're using tissues, they're using elbows, they're getting other people to open it. They will not touch doorknobs. And if they do accidentally, they might have to do a compulsion. And so you might say, well, what's an exposure for that? And you might think, well, the exposure would be the same for all 3 children because they all won't touch doorknobs. And so maybe the exposure would be, touching the doorknob with their pinky and then touching their lips or touching the doorknob and then, eating food or whatever, right? I mean, it should be pretty consistent because they all have the same compulsion. That is incorrect. And I learned this the hard way as I was a green therapist in the beginning, where I would assume that the exposure would be the same for all 3. And I had kids who would tell me, this doesn't bother me. And I'm like, well, why doesn't this bother you? It bothered the other person who had the exact same compulsion. Well, because the core fear is different. And that's why you really want to work with a seasoned therapist, or you want to fully understand this a little bit better, which is not rocket science. You just need to have good resources in how to learn this stuff in an effective way. But what if one of those kids had a core fear that said, if I touch the doorknob and I get germs on my hand, and then I touch a cup and my mom touches the cup and my mom gets sick and then my mom dies, I'm going to be responsible. And I can't handle that. So my core fear might be related to, I don't want to harm my family members because I won't be able to live with myself if I am responsible for causing any harm to them. And so my core fear is the fear of harming my family members and the fear of not being able to live with the guilt. That's one. Now, the second one might be the kind of thing that we think about. They're worried that they're going to get germs on their hands and then they're going to touch their mouth, they're going to eat something and they're going to get sick. So their core fear might be, getting sick, and the core fear underneath that might be, I'm afraid I'm going to die if I get sick, or I'm afraid it's going to be really painful. But it's not, there's a core fear underneath getting sick, even below that. And the third one might have this just disgust OCD. Like, ew, there might be semen and bodily fluid on the doorknob. And I see that a lot. So I'm using really gross examples because they're realistic. And I think it's really important for us to destigmatize a lot of these more taboo, intrusive thoughts so that you know that they're happening in a lot of your kids, especially those that are in puberty and beyond. Lots of semen on doorknobs. That is a really, really big one. Bodily fluid, but in particular semen. It's a very common one, especially as boys get older. They feel really gross. Like, what if one of my family members touches that? So that can go both ways. That can be, what if I accidentally have that on my hand still and I get it on the doorknob and then my mom touches it? That's so gross and I feel so bad. And so it's just disgusting. Conversely, it might be, ew, what if I touch the doorknob and there's bodily fluid already on there? That's gross. And so it can go either way. And you can see the core fear is different, right? I don't want to be gross and spread my grossness everywhere from their misperception of all that. Or I don't want to touch something that's gross. That's gross to me. So we took 3 examples of 3 kids with the exact same compulsion and 3 really, really different core fears. And the exposures might look different. And so I do have a workshop on how to find the core fear, because normally at this point, if I was talking to a live audience or I was talking to my AT parenting community, because we do weekly live classes, somebody would say, oh my gosh, how do I find the core fear? Because not everybody understands how to find the core fear. I do have a workshop on how to find the core fear in my online school. So if you go to atparentingsurvivalschool.com, scroll all the way down to my workshop section, and I have workshops that are like just quick workshops on very specific topics. And I do have one on how to find the core fear. So that could be helpful. If you are in my AT parenting community, you have free access to that. You have free access to a lot of my courses, and you have free access to that workshop as well. So just go into your portal and go into your classes section. Let me see where that is. Yeah, we just revamped the website. So I just had to make sure that I knew where it was. But if you go to AT Parenting Community, if you're a member, you log in. And then if you go to courses, it will be under courses right there. And so you don't have to get that. It's actually, there's 9 courses in here that you have free access to as an AT Parenting Community member. 2 are my series. And so that bottom row, Core Fear Workshop, that's what I'm talking about. So go ahead and find it there. If you are interested in my AT Parenting Community, we do a waitlist only opening periodically. And so you can put your name on the waitlist at atparentingcommunity.com. But find the core fear. The core fear is really important to find. And then exposures will look different. So let's talk about that. So the girl that was afraid to get other family members sick, what I had her do was she touched doorknobs. She did not wash her hands. And these are internal doors in her house. This was way, way before COVID. I feel like COVID did change a lot of how I would do exposures. Like the risk of germs is at a different level now, even though I'm recording this in 2024 where we're past the peak of COVID. But I think we all look at germs a little bit differently after a global pandemic. But so this did happen before then. But I think even at this point, I don't think I'd have an issue doing this type of exposure inside her house. But she would touch doorknobs inside her house, and then she would give her mom or her dad food from her hand. And for her, that was like a 10. That was very overwhelming. Now, if she ate the food, not overwhelming. But if she had to serve it to somebody else, very overwhelming. Because her core fear was harming her family, not herself. Second person who was afraid of germs, that one's much easier, right? So it would be touching the doorknobs inside their house and then eating a piece of candy or something. And then the third one, where it was discussed, it would be touching the doorknob. And sometimes I would do exposures where I would like put something gooey on the doorknob. I know that sounds really gross. I would use glue a lot, where I'd put like a white substance on the doorknob that would elicit that kind of disgusting feeling. Sometimes I didn't have to. We could even just imagine, while they're touching the doorknob, imagine what kind of things can be on that door so that they're really eliciting that disgust feeling and sitting with that discomfort. So 3 very different exposures for 3 very different core fears with the same compulsion. So now you can see why that's important. Now, if you don't know the core fear, it doesn't mean that you can't do exposures. You can, but if I was doing an exposure with the girl that was worried about harming her family members, her touching the doorknob and touching her lips or eating a piece of food or any of those things, it would be missing the mark, right? So you can see why it really makes an exposure more effective. Okay, after the break, I want to talk about, I have a little bit more, I have quite a few more incorrect assumptions about ERP. So stay tuned, we'll be right back.
It's time we put help directly in our kids' hands. Introducing Crushing OCD course for kids and teens.
It was way more helpful than all the other therapy we've ever done because we didn't really know what to do. So we weren't really doing it before. So the course helped to figure out what the exposures are and how to do them.
We're not in therapy and find it really hard to find an ERP trained therapist here. So we're currently with the public health service, but again, they don't seem to be trained in ERP. It's filled that gap that we don't have that was needed.
This was really well timed for us to use between therapists and to help us get off to a good start with this new practice.
It was easy to use. I was able to do it from my phone or also on the computer.
There's different ages, so there were younger kids, there were teenagers, and so that was really nice too, to have a variety of ages where it wasn't just geared towards younger kids or older kids. It was a nice variety.
It's helpful for our kids to hear it from this third party as opposed to just us saying it.
I really like the offense and defense method. I love working on poking at OCD while it's sleeping. It makes it a little bit easier to do, and it's kind of fun. I'm planning on using it to work on my fear of holding or touching batteries and stuff like that.
So it was really helpful, and I think a lot of other kids would like it. I thought that I was the only one who had worrying about the weather and stuff. And then there was somebody else on there who worried about the same thing, which was really helpful.
Seems less scary to work on stuff now that I've watched this class, and I'm more interested to work on it.
I'm trying to do more exposures still, and before I wasn't, I just didn't want to do them.
I've worked on some of my bigger compulsions and been successful.
I realized that it was helpful to do the exposures. Before it was really, really hard. It's still hard, but it's helpful to know that I need to do them.
Before there would be a lot of battles about it. So it is definitely less loggerheads.
Really, really good course and super helpful.
Definitely would recommend this. It's really easy to follow. It's nice bite-sized videos. I really like the worksheets that go along with it, and I think it's really helpful.
To learn more about this course and register your child or teen, go to atparentingsurvivalschool.com.
All right, welcome back. So I have a couple more. They're not in any particular order. These are things that I thought about when I was brainstorming this topic. The next one is a really common one that I think therapists might even think this at times. I think parents might, and it's really important to kind of clarify early on, what is the purpose of an exposure? And a lot of times people will say the purpose of the exposure is to get rid of the intrusive thought. And so when you don't clarify what is the purpose of an exposure, people can get frustrated when they continue to have intrusive thoughts. The goal of exposure is not to get rid of intrusive thoughts. I know, that's really startling, right? You're like, what? It's not. Can you control your thoughts? If I told you to don't think of a white elephant, do you think of a white elephant, right? I mean, we don't control our thoughts. They come, they pop up, and then we think, what am I going to do with this thought? That's the magic sauce. What am I going to do with this thought? I can't control whether I have a thought, but I can control what I do with it. And exposures are like the OCD gym, where you're building your muscle and learning to tolerate the discomfort that comes with the thought. And so if I have an intrusive thought that says, ooh, you want to do something inappropriate with your dog, and then my reaction is, oh my gosh, why did I have that thought? Maybe there's some truth to it. Otherwise, why would I have had that thought? That's disgusting. I'm a disgusting person. And then I'm going to do some compulsions. Maybe I'm going to avoid the dog. That's a compulsion. I'm going to mentally argue with myself, mentally check with myself. I might even confess to my parent. I don't know. I have these thoughts about my dog. Often confessing in that particular theme does not happen because they're too embarrassed. But it's the reaction that's important. So when I'm doing exposures and I'm purposely triggering that thought, putting the dog on my lap or doing an exposure that would trigger that thought, I am training my brain to learn how to handle the discomfort that that thought brings. And so over time, the thought doesn't create as much anxiety and discomfort because I recognize, yep, there's an OCD thought. I've practiced this. I've done a lot of exposures where I've had this thought and I haven't had to do anything. I didn't scratch the itch. I didn't give what OCD wanted. I just sat with it so I can handle this thought. And what happens is you take OCD's power away because when you are not having as much discomfort around an intrusive thought, OCD loses its power. Now, when it loses its power, it may not show up at all. It may get really quiet. Those intrusive thoughts may fall off and you may not have them, but you might also still have them. And that's why it is important to preface that with people that you're working with, whether it's your kids or your therapist and you're working with patients. It's important to clarify and to say, the goal is not to get rid of the intrusive thoughts, because if you're looking at that as a marker of success, you might get freaked out and be like, but I'm still having these thoughts. And then I've had people in my AT parenting community will say, like, my child's really upset because they're still having their intrusive thoughts. And I'll say, how anxious are they when they have them? Well, they're not anxious at all, but they're still having them. Okay. That's success. That's success. And once they realize that is success, you might still have them. You may not, but you might. And it's the discomfort and the stress that it's causing. That's the part that we're trying to work on, not get rid of the thoughts, because we're not magical that way. So I hope that helps, because I think that is a really big incorrect assumption that a lot of people make, including therapists. Another one, and I should have maybe started with this one because it's a really popular one, that it's too cruel. Like, why would I expose them to something that's upsetting to them? Like, this is already torturing them 24/7. Why am I going to tell them to torture themselves some more? And it's hard, but if you look at the science behind ERP, it makes sense. There is something called neuroplasticity. And when you're doing a compulsion, you are firing those neurons, you're growing those neural pathways. And in order to disrupt that, you do need to trigger that OCD thought and not do that compulsion and rewire your brain and tell your brain that there's an alternative action and reaction to this intrusive thought. And so that's why it's important. And that's why I do go into the science in my courses, even in my Crushing OCD workbook for kids. I talk about the science in a very kid-friendly way. And in the AT parenting community, for those of you that are in the AT parenting community, I did make a kid video for members that talks about the science behind ERP. And I go into that, like why, what we're doing in the brain when we don't react to OCD, when we trigger OCD and we don't react to it. And so it's coming from a physiological origin, and that's why it's so helpful. So it's not cruel. It's teaching our kids resilience. It's teaching them how to navigate. They're going to go into that minefield anyway. And do we teach them how to walk through the minefield, or do we just ignore it and pretend that they're not having to do it? They're having these intrusive thoughts anyway. And the more they do what OCD wants, the more it grows. And so teaching them how to navigate those thoughts, how to ride that wave, handle the discomfort is compassionate, because you're giving them tools for life. The other thing that I hear is that it's too hard. My child doesn't want to work on it. It's too hard. How can I trigger that? I hear this a lot. How can we do offense when they're doing defense all day long? Well, you might feel like you're doing defense all day long, but I'm not sitting on the right side of the couch because that's contaminated. And so to do that would be a trigger. That would be offense. And so, yeah, kids are getting bombarded with intrusive thoughts maybe all day long for sure, especially if they have acute OCD. But it doesn't mean that they're doing something that OCD would be like, oh, what are you doing? In fact, most of the time, people who are being bombarded with intrusive thoughts all day long would never do anything that OCD wouldn't want them to do, because they are so ingrained into OCD's good graces that they do everything OCD says all of the time. And so doing something and breaking the rules is so powerful. And starting with any minute, tiny entry point is key. You don't have to jump off the cliff. You don't have to sit on the right side of the couch. Maybe you take a tissue and you touch the right side of the couch, and then a tissue touches the other tissue. And now you have a tissue 3 times removed and you touch that. Or maybe you confess something bad to your parent instead of confessing that you didn't do something bad, right? Like, for instance, if you say, I think I might have stolen gum from your purse, maybe you do an exposure where they say, I stole gum from your purse. And then you role play and you say, oh my gosh, I can't believe you did that. That's horrible. The important thing to do when you're role playing, and I really don't want anyone to take this information from this podcast episode and then go do exposures. Please get educated. I hope that you're getting the point that you need to have some education before you do exposures. So read a book. I have a Crushing OCD workbook for kids. I have courses. There are plenty of other OCD workbooks and courses out there. Educate yourself or have a therapist educate you. Don't just take this little information and run with it. But if I'm doing role playing as an exposure where my child normally confesses to me that they might have done something bad, and the compulsion is for me to give them reassurance of, oh, honey, you didn't really, you thought that in your head, but you didn't say it, you're fine, or it's okay. And we're actually completing the OCD loop. We might decide to do an exposure where they confess something and I give them the reaction they're afraid of. And in that instance, it's really important to collaborate with your child. We don't do this to our kids. We collaborate. Let's do an exposure. What would the script look like? What would you confess to me? And what would be a reaction that your OCD wouldn't like? And we work with them. We don't do this to them. And so that's really important to understand as well. Okay, the last one I want to mention, and I see this one a lot as well in my AT parenting community, and in my online communities in general. But I work in depth with the AT parenting community members, so I hear more from them because they can reach me at any time in the forum. So I hear more examples from them, even though they are probably the most educated parents, especially if they've been in my community for at least 2 or 3 months. They are really educated and they have very advanced questions for me. But when they first get started, I hear a lot of these type of questions that I'm bringing up today. So the last one I want to cover is if I have them do an exposure, then I'm teaching them to do something either bad or I'm teaching them to put themselves in danger. And I'll give you a couple of examples. With moral OCD, let's say you have a child who is paralyzed with the fear that they might be lying. And so some of their compulsions are to say, maybe, I think, at the end of their sentences. Do you want pizza? Yeah, I want pizza, I think. How was your day? It was good, I think. Do you want to go over there? Well, okay, I think I do. Maybe. They always soften it with a word at the end, just in case they're lying. And surprisingly, that's very, very common. That's a very common compulsion. And so the core fear is afraid of lying. And so you might think, oh my gosh, my child can't make a decision, or they can't answer any of my questions. And a lot of times it's because they're afraid that they're going to lie if they have moral OCD. And so an exposure for this might be a game like 2 truths and a lie, where you do exposures can be fun, where, I might say 2 truths about me and 1 lie, and you have to guess which one's the lie. And so you might play with your child, 2 truths and a lie. But if I have a parent saying, well, then I'm teaching them to lie, or I don't want them to think that lying is okay. If your child has moral OCD, the likelihood of them ever being like, oh, my mom thinks that lying is okay, and I've done so many exposures that now I think lying is okay, is slim to none. The feeling is overwhelming and scary for them to lie. And so just doing an exposure that's the opposite of a behavior that their OCD want them to do doesn't mean that they're going to eventually be like, oh, this is a good thing and I should do it. I've heard this also with germs. And, sometimes I can tell that the parent probably has their own OCD because they are getting very, very concerned about, I don't want to teach my child that they shouldn't wash their hands. And if I'm telling them, to touch a doorknob and then not wash their hands, then they're going to get sick. And I really feel like they should wash their hands and they should know. And they get concerned about things swinging in the opposite direction. And really, exposures don't work that way. If it's their theme, And I have been in practice for over 20 years. I know I'm super old. And I have never seen someone have an intrusive thought or a theme and then swing so far in the opposite direction because of exposures that now the opposite end of the spectrum is happening, and that's a problem. I have not seen that happen in OCD themes like that, because that fear is still there. They're just working on it, and exposures really don't do that. So those are just a few of the incorrect assumptions about ERP and about exposure response prevention in general. It is a very, very effective, very well-researched therapy approach for OCD. I have seen so many kids in my practice do well because of ERP. I no longer have a private practice. I closed that 3 years ago, and my focus is teaching parents directly the resources and tools to be able to help their kids directly and connect them to evidence-based trained therapists in ERP so that they can get the right kind of help for their kids. So I hope that this episode helped you understand what ERP is. The more you know, the more you're going to be able to spot effective versus ineffective treatment approaches in therapists, because you can even have a therapist that says they treat OCD and they don't understand ERP in the way that I'm explaining it to you. So the more we know, the more we can help our kids, and the more we can tell whether a therapist knows what they're talking about. So I hope you found that helpful. Don't forget to hit a star and rate my podcast. That does definitely help, and I love when you pay it forward. You can check out my resources at atparentingsurvivalschool.com. And like I said, I have this new workbook that's out, Crushing OCD Workbook for Kids, and it does walk your child through all the steps to do ERP and get them to understand how it can help. And it talks about a bunch of other stuff, but it's everything I would normally do in a therapy practice. If I was seeing your child one-on-one, it walks them through that in 50 fun activities for them to get those skills. So I hope that you find the sparkle in everything you do, and I'll talk to you again next Tuesday. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the AT Parenting Survival Podcast. To get additional support raising a child with anxiety or OCD, visit Natasha's online school of on-demand classes at atparentingsurvivalschool.com.